Welcome all of you on this hastily arranged meeting, and congratulations on getting it working so well. I've got three comments here to introduce as the formal KHS meeting. Following the annual general meeting, your board, usually known as your council, met to choose who would occupy which executive positions. And as a result of that discussion, I was named as your president for 25-26. Kat McDonald became vice president, and Don Richardson and Pete again remain as secretary and treasurer, respectively, and Paul Charbonneau becomes past president. We have two new members, Anne Stevens, who will look after our media contacts, and Kat. And I'll talk a little bit more about their backgrounds in the April limelight. And Craig has taken over as webmaster. So we look forward to working with all of them and, of course, with all of our membership. The second announcement, and I wish I was, that's the one reason I wish we were at Kingsbridge, because I know that when I do this on my computer, you can't see the booklet that I'm about to show you, which I'm not going to show you because you can't see it. But we've been given by the Ottawa Historical Society copies of a booklet that was published in 1979 by the Bytown Museum. It's called Yankees and Loyalists, and its 27 pages detail a walk. It's a walk made by 4 anonymous men from Bytown, Ottawa, to Kingston in order to buy shares in the newly founded Commercial Bank of Upper Canada. One of them kept a diary which details the walk, the progress of the development of the Rideau Canal through the wilderness, and an insight into the lives of the early settlers of Eastern Ontario, both the Yankees, now United Empire Loyalists, and those who stayed after fighting in the War of 1812. If you're interested in a free copy, as I say, it's a 27-page pamphlet, really. Please email me at the Society's email address, kingstonhs@gmail.com. Give your name and address, and we'll get it delivered to you. And the third announcement is going back to an old practice that we had. We do remember members who have passed away at the annual meeting, but we always used to remember them during the year as well, because in a lot of cases you miss those notices. And so far this year, we have lost 3 members, and I'd ask you to keep their memories in your thoughts as we remember Stuart Renfrew, Sue Kirkpatrick, and David Nicholson. And the Society does send a note of condolence to the families. I hope that list doesn't get any longer, but, well, I won't finish that sentence. Let's leave it at but. So with that, Duncan is hidden. Look at that. This is really technical, isn't it? Very good. Duncan, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, and good evening, everyone, and thank you for accommodating us in this rather unusual fashion. It's my pleasure now to introduce our speaker, Dr. Ralph Boston, who has for many decades lived in the Kingston area, and particularly in the area to our north, in the Lake Country north of Kingston, and that will be the focus of his talk tonight. Ralph began his career as an engineer, graduating from the University of Toronto with a BA in mechanical engineering, followed by an MBA at the University of Toronto. And he went on from there to teach at the University of British Columbia, where after some years he was advised to get a doctorate if he wanted an academic or business career. And for that, he went to the University of Michigan, where he got a doctorate in mechanical engineering. And after that, became a consultant, which served him very well in many companies that he served over the years. He has also taught management, particularly with a focus on how manufacturing companies manage their processes. But after that, he has also taught at Waterloo, McGill, Queen's, and RMC. He came to Kingston, or his first connection with Kingston came in 1964, when he and his wife bought a cottage north of Kingston on Buck Lake. And they came to cherish this decision and the home they bought there, so much so that in 1989, they moved there permanently and have stayed there. That love of Kingston's hinterland has flourished in many ways, culminating in 2004 when he and his wife gifted 103 hectares of land to the Queen's Biological Station. Ralph has also contributed to the biological station in terms of consultancy and advising over the years. So he has made his love of the Lake Country quite evident in his own life. He's published in magazines such as Thousand Islands Life and has displayed a particular love of nature in Canada's hinterland. So tonight he's going to be talking about one of those endeavors that he undertook for the Biological Station of Queens, an exploration of the Mississauga people who lived on that land long before we came. And if you think about it, tonight's lecture and his presence here is one form of the kind of land acknowledgement that we in Canada have come to embrace. This is a celebration of the people who were here long before the white settlement of this nation. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Boston. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm always surprised when I'm referred to as Dr. Boston. At any rate, you've done very well to indicate that my wife and I moved from Kingston to Buck Lake. It was just a matter of love. And the fact that the property was never adequately surveyed was a big factor in my concern, because when they came to look for settlement north of Kingston and bringing over people from Europe, they hadn't surveyed the property from Kingston north to Buck Lake, which was the area that they wanted to have settled. So they couldn't bring them over in a timely fashion because of storms. Then when they got them here, they discovered the land north of Kingston hadn't been surveyed. Winter closed in, and so they became Kingston residents. Then, come spring, they had to get these people who'd suffered all sorts of diseases over the winter, and people had died and been very ill. So it was really urgent to get people out on the land. So when they did their surveying, they went north, west, then north again, and east, and they never closed. They went up and zigzagged all the way to Buck Lake. Now that meant that any errors in surveys were all going to be taken and adjusted on my property at the top end. So land was cheap those days, particularly the rock lands, the barrens in the back of Buck Lake. So I started buying up all property I could, and I was getting very cheap. I was getting lots, good sized lots on waterfront or water or ponds for something like $6,000. So I wound up accumulating about 3,500 acres of land adjacent to my property. So I got involved with, looking at it, and that's where I got my love for the land and the people who used it. And Queen's University Biological Station, Cubs, they were a prime factor in my exploration of what are you going to do with all this? And they were asking me what I was going to do with it. We decided I'll give it to you. And so we were sitting around a table one day there, and they said, we always thought there were native people, Indians, on our property. We found artifacts, but we've never found any indication of habitation. And I said, well, that sounds like an interesting problem. As a consultant, I'll take on the assignment for you and see if I can find anything about habitation on your property. Well, I did, and this is the story that comes out of it. Initially, this study was to examine the past presence of Indigenous people on land now held by Queen's Biological. This property is north of Kingston, roughly between Apinican Lake and Buck Lake, east of the Reed Oaks Canal, towards Perth Road. I'll show you a map of that later on. The study area grew because the original area was only the winter hunting ground of the Mississauga people. They were nomadic people who lived off the land as far north as the edge of the Canadian Shield, that is Westport West. See our first map. This map shows the area of Queen's Biological Station property. It starts at the north at Bedford. That shown red is the start of where I began looking at the property of the Queen's Biological Station. This starts at Bedford Mills, move eastward down to Queen's Biological Station. Then it goes further south to Cape Soriel Environmental Studies Area. That's right down the bottom here. And then we move westward to the study area of Queens that we initially had, which is close to Queen's Biological Station. Then we move up to the next red spot, which is Pangman Conservation Reserve, and then north again to Bedford Mills. So that's the property we were looking at initially. The general area that we were looking at subsequently was larger. And this is showing us Buck Lake and the area around Battersea. And we're getting into the area related to the Queen's Biological Station. Aboriginal populations in Canada refers to Indian populations in southwestern Ontario about 1800 AD in areas of prime arable land bordering on Lake Ontario. Indigenous family groups could be found numbering in the hundreds. In dense woodland areas, Indigenous people could only be found in family groups in the tens. By comparison with land close to Kingston, family group size on arable land, which was much more suitable for hunting and fishing and agriculture activities, was closer to 10 to 100 people. Farther north, land close to the Canadian Shield family group size was 10 people or less. The arrival of the Indigenous people in Ontario came in from the southwest. Starting in the west, as the ice sheet melted, southern Ontario became dry land from 10,000 to 5,000 BC. Algonquin-speaking people spread across southern Ontario to Quebec. Within this group, subgroups formed: Algonquin, Ojibwe, Cree, Montagnais. The Mississauga of the Rideau Lakes area were part of the Ojibwe Nation, so they were included. To the north of this group, from Lake Huron to Ottawa, were the Huron people. From south of the St. Lawrence River, the Iroquois people moved north into Ontario and Quebec. The history of the Indigenous people, the Mississauga, is started with the Iroquois along the St. Lawrence River. The Iroquois erected longhouses. They would hold as many as 2,000 people in some 30 houses. Some longhouses would hold as many as 70 people, 7 to 12 people per family. Such villages were protected by a palisade as high as 30 feet. With this lifestyle, they became farmers, planting corn, squash, sunflower, and tobacco. They were also still hunters and fishers. Meat was an important part of their diet. They were warlike people. Raids on other people were common. Women and children were taken captive for wives and slaves. Men were killed in battle or captured and ritualistically tortured and killed. Young boys were trained as warriors. Skill with weapons and courage were praised. Such tendencies caused their neighbors to avoid them. There is no evidence of Iroquois in the Rideau Lakes area, perhaps a temporary presence for hunting. Otherwise, they were in villages east along the St. Lawrence Valley. The Mississauga people, as with the Iroquois, the Algonquin culture entered the area at the east end of Lake Ontario, about 5000 BC. They led the hunter-gathering lifestyle of the archaic people of that time. They depended on hunting large mammals, moose, deer, and smaller ones, beaver, otter, and others, including squirrels, chipmunks, groundhogs, as well as fish and birds, passenger pigeons, geese, ducks, and partridge, etc. Their diet also probably included plants, lily and cattail roots, wild rice, wild onions, as well as berries. The berries were raspberries, blueberries, wild cherry, and grapes. They also used some plants and herbs as medicines. The European contact. About 1000 AD, the Norse made the European discovery of Canada. As early as 1630, French traders acquired furs from both Mississauga and Mohawk at Fort Frontenac, Kingston. Jacques Cartier had visited Canada earlier in 1535 and met Iroquois at Quebec City and Montreal. By 1601, they had disappeared from the area. During the period of 1625, 1649, close contact increased between the French and the Huron people in Ontario. In 1758, Fort Frontenac, Kingston, was captured from the French. By then, the Mississauga had control of all the country north of Kingston. By 1765, the Mississauga were generally friendly with the English. The French presence was by then mostly at trading posts or established campsites along the Rideau River system all the way from Kingston to Ottawa. After the American Revolution and the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the British began to transfer large tracts of land from the Mississauga. The purpose was to settle thousands of American loyalists from the war and Indigenous people who had fought for the British at new homes in Canada, in the Canadian wilderness. This land transfer was agreed to in 1836 by the Mississauga and the British. By 1840, the Mississauga Nation was destroyed. A population of hundreds had been nearly halved in a decade. Population location, see map 3, page 9. From this study concerning the Indigenous people in the Cubs land holdings, we started in the Kingston area and researched northeast up the Rideau Canal and the area between it due north to Frontenac Park and on to Bedford. So you can see that we start at Latimer in the extreme southern area. And following this green line up here and along there, up as far as, that was as far north as the Cubs property was concerned, and came back along this line, back down here to Latimer, and then the other branch, the first one went up there to Bedford Mills.
Yeah.
The whole property area that we're dealing with in this study starts at roughly Latimer. This is where the Aboriginal people began and moved all the way up to Oso and over as far as Rideau Ferry and down again through Sealy's Bay and Latimer to Kingston. So this central area was the original study property. But we found there's no evidence of the Mississauga people living there. So we had to increase the whole study area, and we found it came over as shown at the extreme limits of these red marks. In Kingston, there are 3 known sites of Indigenous settlement in Kingston. Fort Frontenac excavation indicated an Indigenous population on the site prior to the arrival of the French in 1682. Evidence suggested that a close relationship existed between the Indigenous people and the French. The 1682 and 1685 plans for the fort include a chapel, housing for the French and Indigenous, barns and stables. The first plans also show a chapel on the southwestern section of Queen's campus. The principal Indigenous site was located on the Cataraqui River on Bell Island. It was only identified some 40 years ago, but not recorded until the early 1980s. Testing has since confirmed it to be an extensive campsite from middle to woodland transition period. Evidence was found of 1,800-year-old human burials. Also found were some early trade goods and forged nails mixed with indigenous materials. The 1862 plans for Fort Frontenac show a trading post on Bell Island. No evidence has been found of it, but there must have been an Indigenous and French population there, even if only temporarily. Major Bonnycastle, commander of Fort Henry, reports recruiting a group of warriors to assist in protecting Kingston during preparation to foil an expected attack by Patriot rebels in 1838. These Indigenous warriors probably came from Tynedinga, although there are other possibilities. Rideau River Valley. Though well north of our study area, the upper end of Big Rideau Lake, just above Rideau Ferry, is of interest. On the southern side of the lower Rideau Lake, the White Site, it is important for the excellent information it has provided on the initial woodland period. 4 samples of ceramic pottery have been dated 2 to 6,000 BC. One 2500 BC and another 1455. They confirm the presence of archaic peoples at the Rasger Large site. It is located at the most northern point of the Champlain Sea. It provides water access south through Westport and onto Christie Lake and Bob's Lake. This suggests that the archaic people could have located there too, as the Champlain Sea retreated. The Rideau River also connected to other lake systems to the south. Examples are Newborough Lake at Sand Lake and Apinican Lake by what is now Chaffee's Locks, via Bedford Mills to Devil Lake, and via Mississauga Creek to Buck Lake. At the southern edge of the ice covered melted, it exposed land at the edge of the Champlain Sea. It is believed that as it did retreat, early Indigenous people hunted seal with stone spearhead spears in the area. Proof of this hypothesis is a spearhead found near near Cubs Land. It was found at the east end of Buck Lake, Buck Island, that is. The Museum of Civilization dated the artifact as about 9,000 years old. This matches the first occupation date further west in southeastern Ontario of Indigenous people from the south, 11,000 BC. Another site on the south branch of Buck Lake, adjacent to the boat launch, rumor has that it a collection of arrowheads was found there. It is also believed to be a site where indigenous people gathered to trade furs to manufacture arrowheads. Another interesting location of the indigenous people was Rock Lake and Apinnacan Lake. Another collection of arrow and spearheads was found on Apinnacan Lake. The Houston family holds them. They were found on the family farm adjacent to the north shore of the lake. It is a large collection, originally about a basketful. Some of the arrowheads have been dated to about the time of Christ, others much older, about 7,000 years ago. It is possible other persons in the area have smaller undated collections. Again, this is evidence of indigenous people being in the area. No evidence has been found of dwellings. It is assumed the artifacts came from the transient hunters who merely camped on sites while on the hunting trips. Also, it could have been a camp site for trading purposes with other indigenous people or with the French traders. In the period 1800 to 1900, land requirements for survival was as follows. This is very interesting. The settler homesteader required between 20 and 100 acres of land for his family. Arable land of partially cleared deciduous woodlands for farming. This was about 4 million square feet. By comparison, an Indian group, indigenous people, 1 to 1.5 square miles. This comes to about 27,500 square feet. This was included land, ponds, swamplands, open land, and deciduous trees for the lifestyle of the nomadic people. What I find interesting is that the indigenous people needed 5.5 times the amount of land to survive on compared to the white man. Bedford, after the American Revolution, 1775 to 83, the British wanted the support of the indigenous people to help keep the Americans out of Canada. Land was to be open for settlement by displaced loyalists and indigenous people who had supported the British. To this end, the Crawford Purchase of 1783 was negotiated, and others, the Upper Canada land surrenders. Crawford negotiated with Chief Minas, who lived at Oka, land of two mountains, north and west of Montreal at St. Anne de Bellevue. The elderly chief claimed to own all the lands from Brockville, Jones Creek, or Anagara River, to the Trent River, Bay of Quinte, including all the islands extending north from Lake Ontario back as far as a man can walk in a day. Assuming a man can walk 4 miles an hour in a 12-hour walk, he can travel 48 miles in poor territory, including lakes, streams, and swamps, and assume he could accomplish only half that distance, except in winter over the frozen water. This would mean the purchase of the land would extend to about Bedford, due north of Kingston. In the discussions with Crawford, Chief Minas made it clear he did not mind Europeans being settled north of Kingston, but he did not want Six Nation neighbors to be settled there. They were far more numerous than his people and would overrun the hunting grounds. The Mississauga would then have to move to new and more distant grounds, not so good or convenient to them. When the British surveyors came to lay out townships, they learned Chief Minas did not control all the land he claimed. UA loyalists arrived but had to return to Montreal over the winter. The next year they arrived again and settlement to the north began. British military personnel also obtained the right to acquire land north of Kingston. The British honored their agreements with Minas as to gifts to the Mississauga people. They came annually to the Kingston area to receive them. In 1832, the Mississauga Reserve was created in Bedford Township. It is located at the south end of Wolf Lake, north to Long Bay, Bob's Lake. Interestingly, only 16 lots reserved were initially taken up. This is indicative of the fact that some Mississaugas did not wish to give up their nomadic lifestyle. Latimer. The village of Latimer is located due north of Kingston, just east of the south end of Wilbur Lake. A group of United Empire Loyalists had settled in the north of Kingston, Pittsburgh Township. The Indigenous had long been a terror to those early settlers. By the time the Crown bought those lands, however, the Indigenous had ceased to be a menace.
Paul Van Nest again, we ran out of battery power. And so the result is that we've had to reconvene to carry on with the rest of the program, which will be stitched to what we've already broadcast. And it will then be put on our webpage as a complete program. So take it away.
Otherwise, the Indigenous people pursued their living off the land, possibly traveling as far north as Bedford, Wolf's Lake, and Bob's Lake. As early as 1700, a few families numbering some 40 people lived at the west end of Wolf Lake. It is likely that for this reason, the Crawford Agreement in 1832 created the Mississauga Reserve in Bedford Township at this location. It has been suggested that the Mississauga wanted the reserve not so much to settle on, but to preserve it as a hunting ground. In 1835, the Mississauga sold the reserve back to the Crown. The 20 families expected to settle there initially were instead settled on a new reserve on Rice Lake, north of Oshawa. Bedford Mills. The Indigenous settlement at Bedford Mills is interesting because it is different. Under Francois Edward Antoine, Algonquins came to Bedford Mills from the Lake of Two Mountains. This is at the east end of Montreal Island, adjacent to St. Anne de Bellevue. They came to live off the land as well as on it at a settlement. After several years, one band member said to Chief Antoine, "We cannot subsist on hunting alone." This was despite records showing he had just sold many animal hides, 20 deer, 1 moose, and almost as many small animals. This was in 1845 with a band population of 57 people. 7 years later, most had departed. Devil Lake. In 1834, 10 Mississauga adults returned to Bedford Township. They appeared to have come from Grape Island, Bay of Quinte. They settled around Devil's Lake, West End in 1842. Also, no concrete information was found relative to this site. Several references had been made that the Indigenous people did live there. This matter needs investigation. One is, or also is in one reference that John Antoine is said to reside in Oso, just north of Charlotte Lake. The same name appears somewhere in references to Bedford Mills and Oka, Mississauga settlements. It is possible all mentions are of Francois Antoine, Mississauga chief at Bedford Mills, or perhaps his son. This should be investigated. Summary. The fur trade brought exposure to European goods and weapons. The Indigenous people became dependent on them. Unlike the Americans, the British formed ties with the First Nations. This led in 1763 to the Royal Proclamation for the peaceful acquisition of Indian lands. In 1783, the lands north of Kingston, including what is now Frontenac Provincial Park, were acquired by the British government. The transfer of land, first to the British and subsequently to the Canadian government, did not immediately end the Indigenous occupation of the land. Some moved onto the land set aside specifically for them. Others just stayed on forfeited property. By the mid-1800s, the Indigenous population was diminishing. Contact with the Europeans exposed them to new diseases. Smallpox, diphtheria, for which they had little immunity. Pre-contact diseases such as tuberculosis, pneumonia, and giardia, known as beaver fever or swamp fever, were also taking their toll. While tuberculosis could be fatal, beaver fever, a parasitic from contaminated water disease, was mainly only a debilitating short-term malady. Alcohol supplied by traders was another major factor causing death. In addition, a changing lifestyle led to a tragic population reduction. Increasingly, they were settling on the land and losing their nomadic way of life. They reduced their hunter-gatherer and fishing lifestyle. They adopted log cabin housing, kitchen gardens, raising of cattle and pigs for food, horses for logging, land clearing, and transportation. But they did retain their old ways too, especially hunting, fishing, and canoe travel. To maintain the new lifestyle, cash was essential. Trade in game, fish, and other products of the land was insufficient. They sought part-time employment as laborers and low-level trades employees. The Indigenous men were fearless and strong, immune to the extremes of weather. They were sought after employers in logging, timber rafting, mining, above and below ground. Fatal accidents were common. The Indigenous population was diminishing rapidly. For the survival of families, interrace marriages increased. By 1900, it was hard to find pure-blood Indigenous people north of Kingston. In the middle of the 1900s, the Canadian Department of Indian Affairs proposed a study of a mixed group of Europeans and Indigenous people. All family heads had the same surname, Green. The groups numbered about 50 in total. They were all located in Sydenham, Perth Road, Bedford Mills, a triangle in South Frontenac Township. It was estimated that half the group had pure European ancestry. The others were of mixed European Indigenous ancestry. It is not known whether this study was ever completed. My daughter married one of the members of that group. He became a good friend of our family. So far as the study group is concerned, it is interesting to know that the author here, his daughter married one of the members of the study group. A number of other people that I knew of in the Perth Road area were also in the study group.
Well,
it gives you some idea of how closely I was related to the activities of the Indian people in the area.
Right.
Continuing, the motor car and its mass production in the United States, which began in the early 20th century, exacerbated the problems of the Indigenous people. It gave great mobility to the middle-class population. They could now escape the hot summers in cities and holiday at cottages, as had wealthy people for years before. In southeastern Ontario, American vehicular tourists traveled north across Canadian borders to hunt and fish. The islands and the St. Lawrence had long been havens for wealthy Americans. With automobiles, they formed touring clubs. One of these in particular, the Philadelphia Touring Club, had found the lake country north of Kingston to their liking. They came back summer after summer to camp, fish, or hunt. Similarly, local people found subsistence living on barren lands bordering the Canadian Shield intolerable. As the locals said, those with ghetto up and go got up and left. They abandoned homes and farms. They migrated to the local villages or moved to Kingston to find employment and a comfortable lifestyle. Those who hung on discovered that the summer never wanted to summer newcomers wanted to establish permanent cottages on local bodies of water. Land was cheap, some of it going for tax sales. The author himself bought some property in his area for as little as $6,000 for 20 acres. Local residents were happy to sell off small cottage lots on waterfront property for capital gain. For some local people, it meant they could retire on the remaining backland. More importantly, the local living at subsistence level found that they had marketable skills the cottagers needed. The local men could build, this is the Indian men, install or repair anything a homeowner needed. They built cottages, fireplaces, and docks. They installed furnaces, connected houses to electrical power lines, dug or drilled wells, and created water supply systems. They replaced outhouses, installed septic tank systems. It was a win-win situation for everyone. Yeah. Even local women profited. They baked and sold bread, cakes, pies, and cookies to the cottagers. They sold garden vegetables and fruit. Some even opened small shops in local villages. Men found employment as the cottagers demanded new services, telephones, daily mail, garbage removal, a fire department. By the late 1950s, there was hardly a remaining farm left north of Kingston or south of Frontenac Park. The days and ways of the Indigenous people had come to an end. In summary, it would seem that the territory of the Mississauga in the study area was as follows. South of an east-west horizontal line, just north of Westport, bounded by Highway 15 on the east and Highway 38 on the west, ending in the south at Highway 401, north of Kingston. That was the territory of the Mississauga originally. The arrival of Indigenous people in the study area goes back a long way. Most of them proved to be non-permanent. In 11,500 before the present, Clovis were in the area. By 7,000 BP, the Laurentian archaic people had replaced the Clovis. In 5,000, the woodland natives had become residents. In 1600 BP, the Iroquois Huron people established themselves in the area. 1700 AD, Ojibwe and Mississauga people established themselves at Bedford. In 1834 AD, Mississauga returned from the Bay of Quinte area to the north of Kingston. By 1975 AD, the era had come to an end. One estimate is there were never more than 275 Indigenous people in the study area. In 1819, John Ferguson made the Rideau Purchase for the Crown. It included all the land of the Mississauga up to Oso and South Sherbrooke Township. The census identified 257 Ojibwe Mississauga people in that territory, but that figure was diminishing rapidly. Population loss was attributed to exposure to European disease and pre-contact diseases. Most devastating were the fatal effects of excessive alcohol consumption, partner abuse, knife attacks, multi-person brawls, falling injuries, passing out in the cold. Another factor was the overhunting of game animals for the fur trade. This caused by the need for cash to meet the desired new non-nomadic lifestyle. Then when the fashion use of furs in Europe collapsed, the indigenous people left for arable land on reserves, so that by 1845, this trend was well advanced. 100 years later, the trend was complete. No full-blooded indigenous people remained in the area. Mixed indigenous European blood families moved on to arable land and prospered. Some had farm jobs. Those who settled on reservations found city jobs in local populations, and which became preferable. The French. After France was defeated in Canada by the British, it lost the ability to colonize the country. It did, though, seek to maintain a good rapport in Quebec because France wished to maintain its hold on its fur trade monopoly. After the American Revolution, France had no cause to increase settlement in Canada, especially Upper Canada. Britain had the advantage of the thousands of United Empire loyalists and indigenous people who wanted to settle in Ontario to escape persecution by Americans. They had fought for the British, and fleeing north of the southern Great Lakes was the route to survival. The British wanted to settle these people in the area north of Lake Ontario to discourage the Americans from considering invading Canada through that route. The only other major French interest in Canada was that of the Catholic Church. It had wanted to introduce Catholicism to indigenous populations. This was encouraged by the French government because it facilitated the fur trade with the indigenous people at French trading posts. The only other significant comment on the French came from Brevet Major Richard Bonnycastle. Brevet, incidentally, means the rank given to a civilian in command of military personnel. Bonnycastle was a civil engineer in charge of military construction projects and a man of great repute in the community. Major Richard Bonnycastle of Fort Henry, in his diary, made the following summary. Quote, "The Frenchman was, however, adapted by his nature to win his way, either by force or by friendship with the warlike, the untutored Indian, accommodating himself with easy to the nomadic life of the tribes, contrasting his lively and gay temperament with the solemn taciturnity and immovability of the savage, dazzling him by the splendor of his religious ceremonies and coinciding in his recklessness of life, equally a warrior, equally a hunter, unmoved by the dangers of canoe navigation, for which he seemed as well suited as the red man himself. The restless Gaul was everywhere feared or everywhere loved. His reputation was everywhere." Conclusion. The British had accomplished their goal. Land along the St. Lawrence River and Lake Ontario, well back into the interior, had been settled. The Americans to the south were no longer attempting to invade Canada. The above material concludes the work I agreed to do for Hubs, Queen's University Biological Station. The report is based on references, materials readily available in local public libraries. For instance, Kingston, Sunbury, Elgin, Westport. The book, History of Frontenac Park, was very useful also. The copy will soon be left with Cubs. And for recreational reading on the Arctic lifestyle of living off the land in northern Alberta, Permanent Astonishment by Thompson Highway is recommended. Also useful when writing on the subject, Elements of Indigenous Style, a guide for writing by and about Indigenous peoples by Gregory Youngin. Additional observation. In the course of the study, the author was reminded of his various experiences with Indigenous people. One goes back over 80 years. That was when two fishing guides from the Stony Lake area explained to a young lad living in a nearby, or cottaging in a nearby lake, to substitute for them as a fishing guide for a couple of American tourists. Interestingly, these guides likely were Mississauga from Curve Lake Reservation, who hunted and fished Stony Lake. Others relate to consulting engineering assignments where he dealt with exceedingly competent, well-trained Indigenous professional experts in remote locations, Churchill Falls, Labrador, Pinawa, Manitoba, several reserves in Western Canada, and at Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories. At the last location, he saw a man driving a dog team across the snowy tarmac. This local Indian had come to take his wife and newborn baby home 100 miles over snowy country at minus 30 degrees.
Yeah.
More recently was a long-range study for Frontenac Township. It looked at land development planning over a 20-year period. As chairman of the South Frontenac Recreation Committee, he had a committee member of mixed blood who was awarded the Order of Canada for her community development and related fundraising efforts. A charming woman. For over 50 years, the author lived on Buck Lake, acquiring some 350 acres of non-arable land south from the lakeshore. Living there included time spent hunting, fishing, exploring the back lakes that are now Cubs property. There was much to find, from the obvious swamps and little lakes near Hinge Lake to the unexpected abandoned mines, telltale signs of past habitation like Stagecoach Springs and evidence of a wood frame. The lifestyle of the author while living on Buck Lake, including wood harvesting for heat and cooking with wood, hunting and fishing for food, making maple syrup. He learns something of what it was like to live off the land. He enjoyed his contact with locals, collecting their stories, paying attention to their ways. From this background, several byproduct observations of the above study may prove interesting. Land and animal management for sustainable habitat. This is an interesting topic. After the settlers arrived north of Kingston, the Mississauga developed an almost symbiotic relationship with them. Around the homesteads, the settlers cleared land for agricultural purposes. They clear-cut trees, cleared brush, and burned it. Sometimes a fire would get away from them, and a significant grass fire would result. Everything was burnt to the ground. Sometimes this was even done on purpose. The result is clearing for a field. Grass weeds, small shrubs, and tree shoots would grow before the farmer got around to cultivation. Deer found the new growth to their liking and came up to browse. The indigenous people found this a new hunting ground. They culled the deer for valued meat and hides. Sometimes they would share their meat with the settlers. The settlers benefited in another way. The deer stayed away from the settlers' wives' farm gardens. Similarly, industrial activities provided benefits for the indigenous people. Abandoned exploration mines, shafts, pits, and caves were taken up by bears and other animals for winter hibernation. There they were much easier hunting than free roaming in the summer months. Similarly, loggers breaking beaver dams for spring running of logs to the sawmill was mutually advantageous. Draining a shallow pond of swamp encouraged new summer growth, grass, reeds, wild rice, etc. Deer would move in to feed. In fall, they were harvested and the dam rebuilt. Water refilled the area, and the process was repeated annually almost. In deep ponds, when loggers broke a dam, it would be promptly rebuilt to maintain the beaver and other aquatic mammals and the water birds of value to the indigenous people. The indigenous people were conservationists in another way. They managed the wildlife they were hunting. Their hunting ethics were designed to maintain animal populations. Only bucks were to be taken. Does were to be bred and perpetuate the group. Bucks were to breed does and could serve as more than one doe a season. Hence, bucks were culled from a herd with care. Similarly, fawns of either sex were to be allowed to grow to full size before being killed. Anyone breaking these rules was ridiculed and or shunned. The only exception was an injured animal, for instance, a deer that had fallen on the ice breaking a hip or a leg. It was amazing how frequently we saw this from our window at Buck Lake. Similarly, with fish, small trout, pike, pickerel, and bass, they were to be released. Panfish, sunfish, rock bass, perch were exempt from this reservation. Like with deer, any wounded bird or animal was to be retrieved. Many good stories of the chase result from these regulations. Conclusions. As for the original cubs' interests, some important lessons were learned. 1. Hunter-gatherer people can live off the land if they are willing to travel continuously to find food. Secondly, hunter-gatherer people need to have sustainable food harvesting practices to keep food sources productive over a long time. 3, hunter-gatherer people must also have humane animal killing and management practices. 4, weapons manufacture and use are effective. The simpler and more easily produced, the better. 6, the length of time to do something well is of no great importance. 7, over-harvest an area is unwise. Letting an area lie fallow for several years will allow stock to rebuild and yield better results. These ideas can all lead to valid Queen's University biological studies research projects. Afternotes. With respect to the first map, it is quite possible that the west shoreline of the Champlain Sea at some time ran close to Kingston, closer than now. It probably ran east-west somewhere between Apinican Lake and the present Highway 401. It is known that the glacial ice grew south, then receded north some 3 times over the glacial period. It is even reported that the glacial ice sheet reached south along the shore of Lake Ontario. There's evidence, it is reported, that it extended at one point as far as 50 miles south of Rochester. Related to the glaciers, recently the History Channel had an excellent Ice Age program. It detailed how the Earth's climate had changed in the pre-biblical times. It was similar in the Black Sea region of southeast Ontario as in the Rideau Valley. The result was an ice age and then a recovery that resulted in the Great Flood of the Bible. The effects in the Black Sea region were similar to those related to the creation and retreat of the Champlain Seas. The time frames were similar. There the paper ends.
And there's the we don't have much of an audience here, as you might guess. Well, the author that Ralph is referring to is, of course, himself. And in that line, he has actually written a book. There are, I think, roughly 6 copies of it at Novel Idea, but they can make more if it's needed. And the cost is $15, I think.
I believe so,
Yep.
yes.
He's not making a penny on it, folks. At $15 will tell you that. But if you're interested in getting this paper and the maps and in print, that is certainly available to you. Ralph, this has been fascinating. You've covered so much, right from the not just the archaeology and the native peoples, but given us a great deal of the ice age and the geology in the area, geography as well. Lake Ontario being a part of, underneath, if you like, Champlain Lake and Lake Erie too.
Well, the interesting thing is the lifestyle we found living on the shore of Buck Lake, backing on these lands and visiting occasionally with the native people was a tremendous experience. We lived on that property for 60 years. And so that I speak with confidence in what I've said.
And you've taken advantage of those 60 years to tell us all that we have here.
What I found.
So thank you very, very much.
Welcome. Thanks for showing the interest.
For sure, there will be a lot of interest. This is the conclusion of this particular program that started Wednesday night and ended Saturday afternoon. Interesting technology. We owe a great deal of credit to Craig Pettis, who is going to stitch these 2 components together, and it will be available on our website. And I'd just like to conclude on behalf of Dr. Duncan McDowell that our next program will be on April the 16th when Dr. Sandy Campbell, she's Emerita Professor of Women's Studies at Carleton University, and she's going to speak on a native of Kingston, Kingston's Kathleen Hammond, the Lusitania, and the White Plague. How's that for a grabber. That's basically the background of World War I, and her story is one of happiness and tragedy. So please join us on April the 16th. Almost certainly we'll be back at Kingsbridge. It's now available to us, to the outside world. And of course, we will be hybriding that meeting, and so you can also see it online. Notes, of course, will go out. So thank you again, Ralph. It's been a pleasure to meet you and to enjoy your time.
My pleasure also to perform. I hope it was adequate.
It was. By the way, the location of this is Cataraqui Heights, which is where Ralph is staying. And that part of it worked out well for him too. Thank you and good night.